Behold the Drake Passage, widely considered the most dangerous expanse of ocean on Earth. At peak, its swells can hit nearly 60 feet or 18 meters high. Yet that is only the start. Tempests can last for days, with surges hitting from every direction. There exist numerous clips documenting the brutal environment found, and the thousands of mariners who met their end attempting to transit. Thus, one would imagine there exist numerous records of the vessels sunk here, but reports are actually quite as scarce as one might imagine. So in this media, we'll examine the Drake Passage and why it's so infamous, the small famous tragedies here, and the part played by Antarctica in those legends, and the fairly perplexing mystery why, though thousands of souls died, specific narratives are tough to find. As usual, listener precaution is urged.
For many years, accounts of giant swells were labeled as hyperbole. It is solely in modern periods that sensors have verified that those surges truly occur and that they may strike with sufficient power to batter huge boats. Even today, they are tough to foresee and mostly impossible to escape if you land directly in the way of one. What made the Viking Polaris accident so disturbing was the setting. This occurred atop a recent Arctic cruiser built intentionally for brutal climates and sailing with superior prediction and expert staff. Still, one lone swell was plenty to shatter hardened glass and slay a traveler inside her room. She might not have realized, but this made her another on a vast roll of casualties the Drake Passage had previously taken.
That Drake Passage is that strip of waters dividing South America away Antarctica, and is a zone that every cruiser that journeys by ship to Antarctica must go travel across. There exist no substitute paths nearby it, and when you exit the safety of either mainland shore, there is no turning. This Drake Passage carries a status that exceeds current boating by centuries, and mariners have forever viewed it as the most grueling and daunting traversals on the globe. This waterway has gained this standing because it is entirely vulnerable to gusts, flow, and surges for thousands of miles. Gales and ice may emerge rapidly, as do incredibly perilous rogue waves. It is also one of the most turbulent masses of liquid on the world, and the logic for that dates back billions of years. Well before any craft wandered that deep south, Antarctica and South America remained then joined. As these two soil blocks gradually moved away as a consequence of crustal movement, a vast liquid canyon formed between them. This produced a robust marine stream that orbits the Earth, which now is labeled as the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, and this stream rushes directly across the Drake Passage. What renders it distinct from any other stream on Earth, however, is that nothing stops it. There is absolutely no soil on its trail. It shifts west to east around Antarctica, building energy as it rolls, and when it crowds through the Drake Passage, it quickens. The total mass of liquid concerned is likewise tough to fathom, and the volume that shifts through this spot every moment deeply dwarfs that of the Amazon River.
The corridor itself remains also immense, extending nearly 600 miles or 966 kilometers across and plunging to floors that balance roughly 11,000 feet or 3,350 meters. That deepness also counts because it permits gigantic swells to build and drift vast stretches without shedding power. Then include the dominant westerly breezes which gust tough and perpetually there, and you have a process that is regularly fiercely boiling. The climate also merely renders stuff harder as heated gas blocks from the Pacific join with chillier southern air, aiding typhoons build that cause chaos in the sector. Gales can bloom promptly and shift wild, sometimes trapping boats in situations that crumble way faster than the bulletin might imply. And sea ice brings further flakes of volatility to the Drake Passage. During the warmth in the southern half, the waterway is mostly void of ice, which is when many boats strive to finish the journey. As winter nears, however, ice creeps northward from Antarctica, rendering the zone virtually impassable. With that stated, though, even at the ideal periods of the year, the Drake Passage is hardly truly a simple transit to do. Given all of this, it could feel rational to bypass the waterway entirely. Anciently, mariners had different choices in circling South America, like the Strait of Magellan or the Beagle Channel. But since these trails provided some refuge from the vast oceans, they arrived with their own troubles. These corridors are slim, gusts change constantly, the tidal streams are robust, and there is tiny space for fault. At least within the Drake Passage, skippers might possess the comfort of thousands of miles of free water where a boat could pivot. And this compromise molded centuries of judgment-making. Also, if you were steering south straight toward Antarctica, the Drake Passage was just the logical path to use, and that is still valid today. Curiously, for ages, European chart drawers argued whether there was free liquid south of the Americas at all. Most thought that the southern waves were barred by Earth, or that any trail across them would be unreachable to traverse. That shifted with the guy the crossing gets its title from, Sir Francis Drake, but he never aimed out to discover a fresh ocean hallway.
In 1578, while navigating the Strait of Magellan during his circumnavigation of the globe, one of his ships was blown far south by violent storms. What Francis and his crew realized from this mishap was that there was open water just below the tip of South America. And further, this hinted at a direct connection between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Francis himself never sailed the route that now bears his name, but the discovery opened up the possibility of the passages of first crossing decades later. In 1616, a Flemish expedition successfully passed through the waters south of Cape Horn, proving once and for all that an open passage existed. Then, as global sea traffic increased through the late 1700s and early 1800s, more ships began venturing into the southern waters. Before the Panama Canal opened in 1914, the Drake Passage played a key role in global shipping. And for vessels moving between the Atlantic and Pacific, it was one of the few viable options. Whaling fleets also began working farther south in the 19th century, adding even more traffic to the stretch of ocean. And with that traffic came losses. Over time, and with enough maritime activity in the region, the Drake Passage accumulated shipwrecks at a rapid pace. One of its most famous tragedies occurred aboard a ship called the San Telmo. Launched in the late 1780s, it was a full-size Spanish ship armed with 74 guns and built for war. By 1819, Spain was struggling to hold on to its colonies in South America, and the San Telmo became part of that effort. In July of that year, the ship departed Buenos Aires with orders to help reinforce Spanish forces in Peru, where independence movements were gaining ground. The San Telmo was in the deep waters by early September, moving through the Drake Passage. This was no doubt the most dangerous part of the journey, and somewhere in that passage, the San Telmo ran into severe weather. Exactly what happened is unknown, as there were no survivors or eyewitnesses to the event, but the ship was last seen on September 2nd near the eastern edge of the South Shetland Islands, just off the coast of Antarctica. After that, it simply vanished. At the time, the assumption was that the San Telmo had likely been overwhelmed by a powerful storm, possibly a cyclone, and sank with all 644 people on board. In waters that cold, survival would have been just a matter of minutes. For a while, this was the accepted story, but then evidence began washing ashore. About a year after the ship disappeared, sealers working near Livingston Island in the South Shetland Islands reported finding pieces of wreckage. Beams and other debris that clearly came from a large wooden ship started to appear on the beach. This was important because Livingston Island sits close to Antarctica, far south of where most sailing ships were expected to drift after a wreck, raising the possibility that at least part of the San Telmo had made it to the Antarctic region. For more than a century, the ship's fate remained uncertain, but in 1960, an Argentinian expedition found more remains of a shipwreck along the coast of Livingston Island. The structure and materials matched what would be expected from an early 19th century warship, and while debate still exists to this day, many historians and maritime experts believe that these remains belonged to the San Telmo.
If this is correct, the implication is that some of those aboard may have survived long enough to reach land. This would have made them the first humans to set foot on Antarctica, only to die there cold and isolated. However, there are no journals or evidence of a campsite on the continent though, so what really happened remains speculation.
Another important part of the history of the Drake Passage is Antarctica. By the time the wreckage of the St. Tomo began washing up, Antarctica was already becoming a mysterious and dangerous destination. The southern continent promised to push scientific discovery and the chance to push human limits farther than ever before. Getting there, however, meant crossing the Drake Passage every time. At the turn of the 20th century, this was still uncharted territory in a very literal sense. Large stretches of the Antarctic Peninsula hadn't been mapped, and even basic questions about it remained unanswered. This meant that expeditions heading south were sailing into an environment where rescue was next to impossible and communication with the outside world was non-existent. One of the ships that would test those limits was a Norwegian-built ship, aptly named the Antarctic. Launched in 1871, the vessel started as a whaling ship and eventually transitioned into an expedition ship, joining the Swedish Antarctic expedition in 1901. The man leading the expedition was Otto Nordenskjöld, a Swedish geologist. And again, at the time, even seasoned explorers like Otto didn't fully understand what might lie ahead. But he planned to work methodically. He'd land a small party to overwinter and conduct surveys while the ship, under the command of Captain Carl Anton Larsen, supported them by sea. The plan was ambitious, but it wasn't necessarily a reckless one. The crew was more than capable with a ship that had proven itself in southern waters, and Carl was no stranger to navigating through thick ice fields. But even with all the preparation, the success of the entire venture depended on timing and conditions that no one could truly control.
Once the ship made it through the Drake Passage and turned south, there would be no easy way back if things went wrong. As planned, Otto and a small party of crewmen were put ashore on Snow Hill Island in early 1902. There, they built a simple hut and prepared to overwinter while carrying out scientific work. The ship would leave them there, continue its work elsewhere, and return the following season to collect them. Once the ship sailed away, the 6 men on Snow Hill Island were completely cut off, and the winter that followed was a harsh one, even by Antarctic standards. Storms apparently tore through the area, destroying part of the hut and carrying away one of the party's small boats. Several of their dogs were also lost in a blizzard. But even so, the men managed to stay productive. They were well supplied, and when the worst of the winter passed, Otto and his companions set out on a long sled journey that would cover hundreds of miles as they surveyed the coastline. Afterward, they returned to Snow Hill, exhausted but successful, and just in time for the date they expected the ship to reappear, but it never did. Unbeknownst to the land party, the ship had been fighting its own battle in the Drake Passage. During the summer of 1902 to 1903, the ship attempted to reach Snow Hill, but found its path blocked by a heavy pack of ice off the northeastern coast of the peninsula. With no immediate way through, a risky decision was made. Carl left 3 men at Hope Bay, near the entrance to the Antarctic Sound, with instructions to attempt an overland journey to bring Otto's party back. However, shortly after departing, the ice they intended to cross broke up and drifted out to sea, leaving open water in its place. Without a boat and unable to continue, they turned back toward Hope Bay, only to discover that the ship was also no longer where they expected it to be. While the party of 3 struggled on land, Carl continued searching for another route at sea. In doing so, though, the ship became trapped in ice. At first, there was hope that it might break free, but that didn't last long. Within weeks, the pressure of the ice on the ship became unbearable.
6 weeks after being frozen in, the crew was forced to abandon the ship entirely. Not long after that, the Antarctic was crushed, and sank roughly 28 miles or 45 kilometers from land. Over the next 2 weeks, the crew hauled supplies across unstable ice floes as they shifted beneath their feet. The currents threatened to pull the floes out into open water at any moment, but eventually, after a final desperate day of rowing their lifeboats through freezing seas, they reached Paulette Island at the end of 1903. This timing couldn't have been more lucky. A violent storm swept across the island the following day, and had the men still been stranded on the ice, it's likely that none of them would have survived it. At this point, the expedition had fractured into 3 isolated groups. Otto and 5 others remained on Snow Hill Island, living in their hut while watching their supplies dwindle. The party of 3 at Hope Bay built crude shelters from rocks, scraps of wood, and tarps. They even insulated the ground of their shelters with penguin skins. Then finally, on Paulette Island, Carl and 13 crew members constructed a rough stone shelter of their own, roofing it with sailcloth and sealskins. For all 3 groups, penguins and seals were eaten for their meat, and their fat was burned for heat and light. As months dragged on, there was no way of knowing whether anyone was coming to help them. Before leaving South America, Carl had left instructions with the Argentinian Navy that if the ship failed to return by a certain date, a search was to be organized. The following season, ice conditions were far lighter than the year before, allowing a ship called the Uruguay to push south. On October 12, 1903, Otto was out sledding when he spotted something in the distance. At first, he mistook what he was seeing for penguins, but when he drew closer, he realized that they were the party of 3 from Hope Bay. Upon meeting, it took Otto a moment to realize who they were, though. The men were apparently so filthy from months of burning penguin blubber that he barely recognized them. That same day as well, the Uruguay reached Snow Hill Island. As its officers were asking Otto if he had seen the rest of the crew from the Antarctic, Carl himself suddenly appeared at the hut with the others in his group, having just arrived from Paulette Island. After nearly 2 years of isolation, every surviving member of the expedition was suddenly and unexpectedly reunited. In all, only a single man died during the ordeal, succumbing to heart failure with the Paulette Island group. Every single other member made it out alive. In November of 1903, they returned to Buenos Aires to an enthusiastic welcome, and the wreck of the Antarctic marked the first documented case of a ship being destroyed by ice pressure in Antarctic waters. When it comes to Drake Passage shipwrecks in history, though none loomed larger than that of the Endurance, which is maybe the most famous expedition in history. About a decade after Otto and his crew were saved, Irish explorer Ernest Shackleton launched the Imperial Transarctic Expedition in 1914, with the aim of being the first to complete a land crossing of Antarctica. Aboard a ship named the Endurance, Ernest left London with a crew of 28, and after weeks at sea, the ship reached South Georgia Island on November 5th. At the time, the island was a hub of the Antarctic whaling industry, and Ernest used the stop to gather information and supplies. He also received repeated warnings. Whalers told him that the sea ice in the Weddell Sea was unusually heavy that year, and the conditions further south were likely to be brutal. Ernest listened, but then chose to ignore the warnings and moved ahead anyway. Just days after leaving South Georgia, the Endurance encountered its first ice pack in the Drake Passage, and progress slowed to a crawl. By early January of 1915, the ship was fighting its way through tightening fields of ice. But after 7 weeks of this, the Endurance could no longer continue. The ship became completely trapped and frozen in the ice, about 1 day away from the expedition's intended landing point on the Antarctic coast. Locked in place, the ship drifted with the pack, moving south at first, and then slowly back north as the ice shifted, and this went on for months. Several months later, winter approached. Daylight faded, and temperatures dropped. Ernest did his best to keep crew morale up by keeping his men busy, but the pressure on the ship kept increasing. Many months later, by late October, the hull was no longer safe. Ice pressed in from all sides, warping beams and splitting the hull. Finally, Ernest gave the order to abandon ship, and all 28 crewmen made their way onto the relative safety of the ice. Camp was set up on a floe nearby, and the men salvaged what they could as they watched the Endurance slowly get crushed. On November 21st, the hull finally gave way and slipped beneath the ice, vanishing into the Weddell Sea. With no ship and no immediate land in sight, the men camped on drifting ice floes.
In the meantime as well, they hauled their lifeboats and supplies as the pack slowly carried them further north. Once again, this went on for months, and when the food began to run out, even the sled dogs were not spared. It wouldn't be until April of 1916 that the ice finally started to break apart again. Out of options, Ernest ordered the men into the lifeboats, and after 5 strenuous days at sea, they eventually reached Elephant Island and set foot on solid ground for the first time in nearly 500 days. Their relief was short-lived, though. Elephant Island is basically as remote as anywhere else on Earth, offering no hope of rescue. So, realizing this, Ernest chose 5 men and took one of the boats, setting out on an 800-mile journey to South Georgia Islands. While this might have been the right choice, and maybe their only hope of survival, every moment of the trip was an absolute nightmare. The boat was constantly threatened by storms, everyone was seasick, and at one point, a rogue wave nearly ended the voyage entirely. 17 days after leaving Elephant Island, they made landfall on South Georgia. However, they landed on an uninhabited side of the island, and their boat was too damaged to continue on. Ernest then chose 2 of the men to join him in walking across South Georgia on foot. Along the way, they climbed mountains and navigated terrain no one had ever met before. Finally, after 30 hours of continuous travel, they reached the whaling station in Stromness, and rescue efforts began from there to save the rest of crew. It would take 4 total attempts over the course of months to reach Elephant Island. Ice blocked the first 3 tries, and by the time Ernest finally broke through on August 30th, 1916, the men he'd left behind were on the edge of starvation. Against all odds, though, every single one of them was brought back to safety, alive.
More than a century later, the wreck of the Endurance was finally located nearly 10,000 feet, or 3,000 meters, below the surface of the Weddell Sea. The Drake Passage is thought to have claimed hundreds of ships and over 10,000 sailors, but the reality is that almost all of those ships went down without a single survivor. On top of that, many of the losses took place centuries ago in an area that is already sparsely populated today. Hundreds of years ago, it was just men in wooden ships and massive swells with no hope of rescue or even anyone to remember their names. The stories that we do have are the ones where someone was alive at the end to explain what happened. In the end, even today, the Drake Passage is considered to be one of the most challenging seaways on Earth. Despite advanced weather reporting and modern vessels, crossings are routinely delayed or canceled entirely. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching.